Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be looking at evolution and selection this afternoon. Okay, this is part of the Unit 4 section and paper. So we're going to be looking at what evolution is, the founder effect, genetic drift, natural selection, and isolation and speciation. The precursor to this part of the unit is variation, which I looked at 2 weeks ago. So if you want to go and look at that video, you can. But I'm going to go through this section this afternoon. So today we're going to look at the theory of evolution, and we're going to look at how these different species were able to become separate species. So evolution is the process by which different kinds of living organism are believed to have developed from earlier forms. So they have developed from earlier forms during history. So the allele frequencies change. So the frequency at which the allele is seen within a population changes, and therefore the phenotypes alter over time. So effectively, it's the change in the average phenotype. Okay, each organism contains just one of the many possible sets of alleles that can be formed from the pool, from the gene pool. Okay, we're going to look at that now. So quickly to kind of recap, the gene pool, so a population of organisms reproducing sexually, has a large amount of genetic variation. A gene pool is all of the alleles, okay, of all of the genes of all of the individuals in the population at any one time. So if the environment changes, some phenotypes will be advantageous and will be selected for, whilst others will be at a disadvantage and they'll be selected against. And then this then has an effect on which alleles are more frequent in the population, leading to change over time. So let's have a look at the founder effect. So the founder effect, there's a clue in the name. It's when a small number of individuals become isolated and start a new population. So they are the founders of a new area. The founders are a small sample of the population they came from, which we refer to as the parental population. So it's just a few individuals from the main population. They may have a different allele frequency from the original population. They might not, but they can have a very different allele frequency because only a few have made it there. And that's the founder effect. Genetic drift is kind of goes beyond that. So whilst the population is small, it might undergo genetic drift and become even more different from the parental population. So in a small population, chance variation in allele frequency can result in a large change in a phenotype for a large part of the population. So in a small population, that change in allele can look like a lot have it, because it's a small population, a lot of that population have that change. And the average phenotype can change rapidly, and the smaller the population, the more significant the effect is. So we're going to have a look at this in action with some diagrams. So here we have the parental population on the mainland, and nothing over here on the isolated island. So you can see here the different alleles shown in yellow and this turquoise colour. So here is the original parental population on the mainland. A few individuals from this original parental population colonize a new isolated area. So this is the founder effect. See, there may be a higher frequency of one allele in the founder population just by chance. So I've actually shown it here. You can see originally there's more yellow allele, and now we have more of the turquoise allele, because it doesn't always have to be representative of the parental population. So there can be a higher frequency of one allele in the founder population just by chance, and it didn't need to be the most common in the parental population. The population grows, as you can see, it's grown from here to here. And after a few generations, the yellow allele here might be completely lost if individuals who have the allele don't have offspring and can't pass on the information. So that disappears. That's founder effect. Genetic drift is when mutations might occur. So we have this population here, and mutations might occur, creating new alleles, as we can see here. It's normal for mutations to happen over time. The new allele becomes more common. As you can see, we've got more with this. And the two populations now look very different to each other. Remembering that the individuals that colonized this section of Ireland, the founder effect, came from this original parental population. So the two populations are now very different. Let's have a look at this question. If you could read the information, I'll give you 10 seconds and I'll change the slide. Have a look at the graph carefully. Okay, moving on, you can pause if you need to. So I've put the graph here for you as well. So you need to pay attention to the emigrated group, the general population, and the general Pennsylvanian population. So have a look at this question, and I'm going to give you 10 seconds to have a go at it before I show you the answer. Okay, if you're not ready for the answer, you can just press pause. So we've got genetic drift or founder effect getting you 1 mark. The emigrated group with an abnormally high frequency of capital N, or you could have said abnormally low frequency of capital M. The emigrated population did not mate with general Pennsylvanian population, so there's no gene flow, no allele flow. Okay, so it's what we said just now in the work. So let's look at natural selection. And we're going to look at 3 different types here. We have stabilizing selection, directional selection, and disruptive selection. And I'm going to go through, and if you have a look at stabilizing selection, just have a quick read over what it has in this image. Okay, so a characteristic showing continuous variation has a range of values. So it has a range of values. In a certain environment, a particular phenotype might be of advantage. In that case, it's selected for, and the extremes are selected against. So the normal curve in the next generation, which is shown here, the normal curve shown in the next generation will have a smaller standard deviation and a higher peak. They're all closer around this section. If the environment stays the same, this continues until most members have the same value. So eventually we're going to be looking at a graph that becomes smaller and smaller with a higher peak. You have an example here. So short tails mess up the cat's balance. So long tails drag on the ground and medium tails are best. So they're going to be centered around the medium. Another example is birth weight in humans. Let's have a look at directional selection. So you can see the original curve and the final curve and the example. In a changing environment, an extreme phenotype might be advantageous. So the other values are selected against. We're selecting for the advantageous phenotype. So over time, the average phenotype changes. So instead of this being chosen for. This is selected, okay, against, and we have the new phenotype becoming more popular. And you've got an example here. Okay, the more it looks like a snake, the better it does. And the last one, disruptive selection. And again, have a look at this information, see if you can decipher what's going on, and then I'll give you an explanation. So here, in disruptive selection, in some situations, the average phenotype is not advantageous, and it's selected against. So the average, the normal that we saw, is not advantageous, and it's selected against. So over generations, a lower and higher value are selected for. Because this wasn't advantageous, they went for another one. Okay, something else was selected for. And the curve shows the proportions of the population with values of the characteristic. And this is referred to as bimodal because it has two peaks. Okay, so we need to remember that it's bimodal, as it's showing that two phenotypes have been selected for, and it has two peaks. Okay, and you can see the example here. Okay, so stabilizing, coming towards that norm. Directional, I use this word to remember, it moves across. And disruptive is where we've got the two peaks. So we're going to look at natural selection, and we're going to focus on Darwin. So evolution by natural selection. Evolution is a process by which new species are formed from pre-existing ones. So you'd have seen this in cell theory as well. So it's the process by which new species are formed from pre-existing ones over a period of time. It tends to be over a long period of time, unless we're looking at something like bacteria, which reproduces every 20 minutes. So we can see evolution happening quite quickly over a few generations. Charles Darwin, who we've all heard about, and Alfred Russel Wallace proposed that natural selection is the force that causes changes in population. So they believed, and they did their work on natural selection being the thing that causes changes in the populations. So natural selection can also maintain variation, keep variation going, and stabilize a population if there is no need to change. So there won't be any selection against it, and it will remain within the population. So we need to look at Darwin's observations. So variation within a population and the tendency for the adult population to be stable in size led to the development of the idea of natural selection. So originally it was an idea, and we're looking at the tendency for adult population to be stable in size because their population is going to be kept controlled by the amount of food available, resources available. Darwin's theory is based on the following observations. So in any population, there's variation. Okay, it's normal to see variation. And individuals within a population have the potential to produce large numbers of offspring, yet the number of adults tend to stay the same from one generation to the next. So what this is saying is that the adults have the potential to produce large numbers, but the adults stay the same. So either they're not able to have offspring all the time, or what's happening is that they are having offspring, but not many of them are making them to maturation. They're not getting to the point where they are adults and reproducing themselves. So the adult population isn't increasing. So two deductions were made from this. So from the observations, they have decided, or it was deduced, it was concluded, there is a struggle for survival. There's competition with only the fittest surviving, which we refer to as survival of the fittest. Which one is able to eat? Which one is able to hunt the best? Which one is able to reach the necessary water? Which one is able to reach the leaves? The individuals that survive, so the survival of the fittest, the ones that survive and reproduce pass on the advantageous alleles for the characteristics that enable the offspring to succeed as well. So it's a selective advantage. So we'll look at an example in a moment. But if something is like a giraffe has a longer neck and is able to reach higher in the tree, it will have an advantage in that it can eat, it can survive, it can reproduce, and it's going to pass on that tall neck gene to its offspring, which can also then survive. So over time, a group of individuals that once belonged to the same species might give rise to two different groups, and they can be quite significantly distinct due to mutations. So they no longer belong to the same species and they've become two separate species. If the environment or conditions then change, the features needed will also change in order to adapt to the new environment. So something will be selected against and something will be selected for, depending on the new conditions. So you probably looked at peppered moth and the black moth during GCSE, and that the peppered moth had the camouflage, and then during the Industrial Revolution there was more ash, and so the black moth had better camouflage, and so that was selected for. They were the ones that survived, and then they passed on their allele, and then there were more black moths than peppered moths. So natural selection is a continuous process depending on the conditions and the environment around. When environmental conditions change, there is a selection pressure, okay? So there is a selection pressure on a species causing it to adapt to the new conditions. And the pressure determines the spread of an allele within the gene pool. It's going to decide which allele is selected for or selected against. So you can see this image here and you can have a read through that and look at what's happening. So as you can see, this image is able to show what we've been through in this information. So it's quite a good way of revising. So here is what we were saying, that there's overproduction. So more individuals are produced and can survive. So they are producing, they are having lots of offspring, but they're not, those offspring are not surviving to maturity. So the adult population isn't increasing. Then mutations cause variation in phenotypes. Some of those phenotypes will be advantageous and will be selected for. Those individuals survive, survival of the fittest, and they reproduce and pass on their alleles to the next generation. So those alleles then become more common. And we can see this here. We've got a lot of light colour here. It's been selected against. This has not helped them survive. They're too obvious. They've possibly been hunted and eaten. So we've got more of the dark fur, because that's been beneficial. It's been advantageous. And so we've had survival of the fittest and natural selection in work. So as it says here, explain the evolution according to Darwin. And there's lots of information on the page already, but I'd like you to think of how you would write this down. Okay, I think you've had a chance, so you will have seen all the information here. It's just about thinking about how you would word that. So we're looking at a short neck length and a long neck length. The longer neck is able to reach higher in the tree and is able to get access to more of the leaves, which enables it to survive and reproduce. That allele is then passed on to the offspring, meaning that the allele for short neck dies out. So let's look at Darwin's finches, and the founder effect and genetic drift contributed to the evolutionary divergence of Darwin's finches, and here they are here. Okay. So scientists believe that a small number of ancestral finches of a single species, so there was one species to begin with, colonized the islands from mainland South America. And I'll show you this on a map in a second. So we had one species living on mainland South America that was able to colonize islands, not really nearby, but fairly nearby. The small number of ancestors meant that there was a reduced gene pool. There was less of a gene pool on this new island. At the time, there was little animal life on the islands, and the birds were in close competition for food and other resources. So thinking now, we had one original species on the mainland, and we now have these finches here. Okay, have a look at the images, have a look at what's different, what's changed, look at the species development. So the voyage of HMS Beagle went along here, round. Sorry about that. Round here, round South America, and the Galapagos Islands are based off of South America, off of the coast of Ecuador here. So they're over here. Okay, so you have mainland South America, here's Ecuador, and Galapagos Islands are around 600 miles away from mainland Ecuador in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so it's not that close, but relatively, I suppose. The Galapagos Islands were formed in recent geological time. They're only 3 million years to 5 million years old as a result of volcanic activity. So we consider them to be quite new, and therefore any living things present must have reached the Galapagos Islands from the mainland. They weren't there already because the islands are new. So Darwin identified 13 or 14 species of closely related finches on the islands. They were closely related, but they are separate species. Okay, each of which occupies a different ecological niche. They have a different area that they're living in and different resources available to them. You can see some of the main islands here. Okay, so these are some of the main islands, and you can see smaller ones around. And here are the different species of finch. So again, have a look at the structure of their beak, especially, and have a look at what they're eating. The finches that became isolated on different islands with different food sources evolved through allopatric speciation, which we're going to look at in a bit. On the larger islands, as you can see, there are some larger islands and some very, very small islands around. So on the larger islands, where there was a greater variety of food sources, different beak shapes were selected for within the same population. So because they could access lots of things, different types of beaks were selected for. This is called sympatric speciation. Eventually, sufficient genetic drift occurred, okay, the mutations over time, that different species evolved. They were no longer the same species. And species is when they can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So they were no longer able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, so they were considered different species. So the change in the shape of one structure to perform different functions and fill different ecological niches is called adaptive radiation. Okay, so the change in shape of one structure, which was their beak, to perform different functions, so to eat berries or crush nuts, meant that they occupied different ecological niches, and that whole process is called adaptive radiation. So let's look at isolation and speciation. Within a population of one species, there are groups of interbreeding individuals. Now, each of these breeding subunits is called a deme or a deme. It doesn't matter how you pronounce it. Okay. So within the population, there are interbreeding individuals, and each one of those breeding units is called a deme or a deme. So new species arrive when some barrier to reproduction occurs. Okay, so we're going to look at these barriers to reproduction. And then the gene pool is divided and different combinations of mutations develop in each pool. So sometimes we're going to look at geographical isolation, which means there's different things available and we get different mutations and then we get a different species. So this was also visible on the Galapagos Islands because the tortoises was a large population. There was an eruption and lava flow, and some tortoises were left on one side and others the other, and they couldn't cross. The food available on one side of the lava flow was higher up. It was higher leaves, and so there is an actual dome. So as we all know that the tortoise's dome, it looks a bit like this. On one side where the food was higher, they had a dome that came up on this side, allowing their necks to stretch further to reach the food. So let's look at the barrier to reproduction. Okay, so a barrier which effectively prevents gene exchange between them. Okay, so these demes or demes, where they are interbreeding, something happens which prevents them from exchanging genes with one another, and it's called an isolating mechanism. So if the separation is long term, the two groups will become so different due to random mutations and different selection pressures that a new species is formed, and that's what I was explaining with the tortoises. The two groups became so different because of the separation, the different areas that they had to occupy, the different ecological niches. They became so different that different selection pressures meant that they were selecting for or against different alleles, and a new species is formed. The two new species would be incapable of interbreeding, so these tortoises then could not interbreed and produce fertile offspring. For new species to develop from a population, some form of isolating mechanism is required. There needs to be some sort of separation as to why they can't exchange genes any longer. So let's look at these. So the first one can be reproductive isolation. Okay, so reproductive isolation within a population occurs when organisms living in the same area, become isolated into two groups. And this is not talking about geographical barriers. So we're not thinking about the tortoise example now. We're thinking about different things that can cause the populations to become separated. Species formation occurring in demes or demes in the same geographic area is known as sympatric speciation. So there's no geographical change, but there has been a different species formation, and it's sympatric speciation. So the barriers to breeding, so these reproductive isolation barriers, can be due to the following mechanisms. So one is behavioral isolation. In animals with elaborate courtship behavior, the display of one subspecies fails to attract the necessary response in a potential partner of another subspecies. So for example, when birds dance, some birds dance in order to court and to mate, and that has not been done well enough for them to attract the subspecies. Mechanical isolation. So the genitalia of the two groups may be incompatible, so they biologically don't fit together. That's mechanical isolation. Gametic isolation. In flowering plants, pollination may be prevented because the pollen grain fails to germinate on the stigma. It doesn't land in the right place. In animals, sperm may fail to survive in the oviduct of the partner. So as the sperm travels through the cervix into the the uterus and into the oviduct, they don't survive, and that would be gametic isolation. Hybrid inviability. So despite fertilization having taken place this time, the development of the embryo doesn't occur. And hybrid sterility. So when individuals of different species breed, the sets of chromosomes from each parent are different, and the sets that can't pair up during meiosis because they're different, and so the offspring are unable to produce gametes. So they're, like I was explaining, they are not fertile offspring. So this is the hybrid sterility. They are sterile, they don't produce fertile offspring. So although the individuals do breed, the offspring are infertile, therefore not carrying on those alleles. We move on to a different type. So reproductive isolation is due to behavior, mechanical, gametic, hybrid inviability, and hybrid sterility. Now we're looking at geographical isolation rather than reproductive. So geographic isolation between populations occurs when the population becomes geographically split into separate demes or demes. This is the example that I've given of the tortoises. Not a perfect example because you need more information, but you get the idea that the ecological niche was slightly different. The food was higher off the ground, and therefore the domed shape of the high domed shape of the shell was selected for. So the evolution of a new species is highly probable given time. This sort of speciation is known as allopatric speciation. The same with Darwin's finches. There was one original species. They occupied different islands with different ecological niches, and they were separated by geographical situations. So it's allopatric speciation. So whatever the nature of the barrier, whether it's geographical or reproductive, between two parts of a population, the process of speciation is variation due to different random mutations is normal within a population. A barrier, whatever the barrier is, separates one part of the population from the other. Despite which type of barrier it is, it still separates one part of the population from the other. The allele frequencies in the isolated populations might be different, remembering they don't have to be the same. In a small population, the allele frequencies might be very different to the allele frequencies in the gene pool of the original population. So we're thinking back to that original where I showed you the different coloured dots, and over here was a different colour that was a higher allele frequency than here. Different selection pressures cause different changes to the gene pool, so different things to select for and against cause different changes to the gene pools in the separated populations. And then they evolve along separate lines. They get different phenotypes, different characteristics that they inherit. If the barrier is removed, there may be sufficient differences to prevent the formation of viable offspring. So a new species has evolved because if you did take away the barrier, these two species no longer interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So they are considered separate species. Let's have a look at these exam questions. So have a look at this question. I'll give you 10 seconds and then I'll go through the answer. Okay, if you're not ready for the answer, you can just press pause. So it's all of the alleles of all the genes in the population. Okay, I would say at any one time, but they haven't specified that here in the mark scheme. That's 1 mark. Have a look at this information, then I'm going to show you the information on the next slide with the question. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide, so pause if you need to. Okay, there's one question to answer here and another here. So if you try those, and then I'll show you the answers. Let's go through the answer. So the link between beak shape and food source. The harder the food, the larger or the wider or the deeper the beak. Long beaks for flowers and fruits, wide beaks for eating seeds. Okay, hopefully you can see that by looking at the information here, okay, and also looking at the shape of the beak. Describe the link between cam and beak shape. The higher the CAM, the longer the beak. So high, elongated, high, elongated, or low CAM results in a short beak. So what's important with this is, although it's really important that we always read the information, we don't need to get confused about the fact that we haven't learnt about molecule 4, BMP4 and CAM. They're giving you things to use your information, to apply your knowledge. You don't need to panic about not having looked at these things before. Okay, we need to look at the information and use the information to deduce, to conclude and get an answer. Next question. Okay, again, little hint, you don't need to worry about that specifically and what it means. Have a look at what it's really asking you. And if you're not ready, just press pause. Okay, so we're talking about founder effect or genetic drift. They have also accepted that there may have been mutation. Okay, and I'm going to go through the answer here. So if you're watching this later, obviously you can go back in the slides and have a look if you want to look at more information here. Let's go through the answer. So birds with high CAM will have longer beaks. Okay, that was given to you in the image. Birds with longer beaks will get more food from cactus flowers, so they're better adapted for feeding. More of these birds will survive, the idea of survival of the fittest. And so they reproduce and pass on their CAM alleles to the next generation. That means the CAM alleles will become more common or increase in frequency in the next generation. And this is natural selection or survival of the fittest. Okay, so you can say any of one of these words, okay, within the context of your answer, and there's an extra mark. So why were the two finches considered to be two separate species? And explain why they evolved into separate species. I should have warned you, sorry. They are not able, so two different species, they're not able to interbreed, okay, to produce fertile offspring, okay? This is really important that you remember to say fertile. Sometimes they can interbreed, but it's not fertile, and that's what separates the species. Explain why they evolved into separate species. If you're not ready, press pause. So you can refer to there having been geographical isolation, and you can say there has been allopatric speciation. over time develop adaptations which prevent successful breeding with the original population, or there is no flow of genes between the two populations. This is sort of what I tend to say. It's less wordy. So there's been no flow of genes between the two populations, which means there's allopatric speciation. Okay, let's have a look at this question. So read the information and the information in the diagram and then answer the question at the bottom. Okay, so you've got the original information and you've got the changed information. And you have a change here. So let's have a look at the answer. If you're not ready, you can press pause. So we can comment on CGC has been replaced by TGC, okay? Or you can discuss that the amino acid cis has replaced ARG. Have a look at this question. Okay, if you can't remember the information, you can look at this one later. Okay, they're giving you key information. They're showing you where, sorry, it says scrub. They're showing you the colour and they're showing you the population. We're also showing you the allele frequency. So use the diagram to suggest how fur colour is related to environmental conditions. And if you're not ready, you can press pause. Okay, that one you may have needed to go back and look at more information. There's been a change in the tertiary structure, a different protein is made, MC1R will not be stimulated by the hormone, and so on. Here, this is related to what we've been doing. Mice with light fur found an environment providing light backgrounds or sandy beaches, and mice with dark fur in forest backgrounds or dark backgrounds. Dark fur is found in the darker background, or light fur is found in the lighter background for camouflage. Okay, hopefully you were able to deduce why that one would do better in the shrub or the forest and why that one would do better on the sandy beach. These next two questions, I've given you the information again so that you can look. Okay, if you're not ready, you can press pause. So, small populations of mice could be the reason. Explain how natural selection could have caused the relative allele frequency shown in population 3. So, why this happened. So, mice with light fur are less easily seen or less easily caught by predators because they're better camouflage, so they have a selective advantage. Light fur mice reproduce and pass on the allele to the next generation, increasing the frequency of the allele in the population, and therefore we end up with 95% of the population having allele C. And we'll do this one last question. Okay, and if you're not ready, you can press pause. Okay, genetic, behavioural, geographic, allopatric, reproductive, sympatric, seasonal, temporal, isolation. So one of those with the word isolation. Thank you for joining me for this session. There's lots of useful information on WJC Blended Learning where you can try questions and go through and get some more knowledge. Thanks for joining. Bye.